will
6
liken him
Jesus
unto a wise
challenged
man
social
which
and
built his house
religious
upon a
norms.
rock.
Throughout his
And the
ministry,
rain descended, and the
Jesus
floods came,
consistently
and the winds
challenged the
blew,
prevailing
and
social
beat
and
upon that
religious
house,
norms
and
of
it
his
fell
time.
not.
His teachings and actions often ran counter to the expectations and practices of the religious authorities, as well as to the social conventions of the Jewish and Roman worlds. Jesus' revolutionary approach to religion, ethics, and society was one of the reasons he was both celebrated by some and opposed by others. He called people to look beyond external rituals, legalistic practices, and social hierarchies, pointing them instead toward the heart of God's law, which is love, mercy, and justice. Challenging the religious authorities. The religious leaders of Jesus' day, particularly the Pharisees and Sadducees, were highly concerned with maintaining the strict observance of religious laws and traditions. However, Jesus often criticized their hypocrisy and legalism. He pointed out that, while they were meticulous in following the outward forms of the law, they neglected the weightier matters of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Matthew 23 verse 23. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for their self-righteousness, saying, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to." Matthew 23 verse 13. Jesus challenged the idea that outward observance of religious rules was the ultimate measure of righteousness. Instead, he emphasized the importance of the heart and a genuine relationship with God. Matthew 15 verses 8 to 9. Furthermore, Jesus' interactions with sinners and outcasts were highly controversial. He spent time with tax collectors, prostitutes, and other individuals whom the religious establishment deemed unworthy of attention. By doing so, he emphasized that God's love and mercy are not reserved for the righteous but are available to all, especially
will
those who
liken him
recognize
unto a
their
wise
need
man
for
which
grace.
built his house
Luke
upon a
5
rock.
verses 31 to 32.
And the rain descended, and the floods
Challenging
came, and the
social
winds blew,
hierarchies.
and beat
Jesus
upon that
also
house, and
challenged
it
the
fell
social
not.
hierarchies and inequalities that were prevalent in his culture. In the patriarchal society of first-century Judea, women, children, and the poor were often marginalized and had little voice or influence. However, Jesus repeatedly broke social conventions to uplift the powerless and give them dignity. For example, when Jesus defended the woman caught in adultery, John 8 verses 1 to 11, he not only prevented her from being stoned but also offered her forgiveness, showing that women too were deserving of God's mercy and love. In a time when women were often seen as inferior, Jesus treated them with respect and honored them as full participants in God's kingdom. Similarly, Jesus frequently emphasized the importance of humility over social status. In the parable of the Great Banquet, Luke 14 verses 15 to 24, he taught that the humble would be exalted, while those who were self-important would be humbled. He urged his followers to embrace servanthood rather than seeking positions of power or recognition, saying, "The greatest among you will be your servant." Matthew 23 verse 11. Jesus' actions and teachings turned upside down the conventional wisdom about power, status, and worth, challenging the concept of cleanliness and holiness. One of the most radical ways Jesus challenged social and religious norms was in his approach to purity and holiness. According to Jewish law, certain actions, foods, and individuals were considered unclean and could defile a person spiritually. These laws were a major aspect of religious life and identity. However, Jesus challenged the traditional understanding of what made a person unclean. In Mark 7 verses 14 to 23, Jesus taught that it is not what goes into a person's body that makes them unclean, but what comes out of their hearts. He declared that all foods were clean,
will liken him
and he
unto a wise
emphasized
man
the need
which
for
built his
inner
house
purity
upon a
rather
rock.
than ritualistic observance.
And the rain descended, and
What
the floods
comes out
came,
of a
and the
person
winds
is what
blew,
defile them,
and beat upon
he
that house,
said,
and
Mark
it fell
7
not.
verse 20. By reinterpreting the purity laws, Jesus emphasized that true holiness comes from the heart, not from external rituals or behaviors. Jesus also healed individuals who were considered unclean, such as lepers and those with various diseases, showing that God's grace and power could cleanse them, regardless of their social or religious status. His touch and compassion for the unclean demonstrated that no one was beyond the reach of God's love, and that God's holiness was not limited by human standards of cleanliness or righteousness. Challenging the view of the Messiah, Jesus also challenged the prevailing expectations of what the Messiah would be. Many Jews expected a powerful political leader, who would overthrow the Roman occupiers and restore Israel to its former glory. They anticipated a military leader who would bring victory and national pride. However, Jesus redefined the role of the Messiah, showing that his mission was not to establish a political kingdom, but to bring about the spiritual redemption of humanity. When Peter declared that Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus warned his disciples not to reveal this to others because their understanding of the Messiah was incomplete. Instead of a conquering hero, Jesus explained that he would suffer, die, and be resurrected. Matthew 16 verse 21. This was a radical departure from the popular expectation of the Messiah, and it was a message that many found difficult to accept. Jesus' sacrificial death on the cross was not the triumph many anticipated, but it was the fulfillment of God's plan for salvation through suffering. Jesus' challenge to legalism and rituals. Jesus often spoke against the legalistic interpretation of the law that had developed over the centuries. He challenged the Pharisees and teachers of the law for turning religion into a set of rigid rules and rituals, emphasizing that the law was meant to point to love for
We
God
liken
and
him
love
unto
for
a wise
others.
man which built
Matthew
his house
22
upon a
verses
rock.
37 to 40.
And the rain descended,
In Mark
and the
2
floods
verse
came, and the winds
27,
blew,
Jesus declared,
and beat upon
"The
that
Sabbath
house,
was
and it
made for
fell
man,
not."
not man for the Sabbath," emphasizing that human well-being and compassion should take precedence over rigid adherence to rules. Through his actions and teachings, Jesus demonstrated that true righteousness was not about rule-keeping, but about loving God and loving one's neighbor. He showed that mercy, forgiveness, and compassion were more important than outward displays of religious devotion or strict observance of tradition. Matthew 9 verse 13. Jesus' life and teachings were a direct challenge to the social, religious, and cultural norms of his time. He confronted the religious authorities for their hypocrisy, challenged social hierarchies and the marginalization of certain groups, redefined concepts of holiness and purity, and reshaped the understanding of the Messiah. By doing so, Jesus called people to a deeper, more authentic relationship with God, one that was centered on love, humility, and grace. His radical approach to faith and society continues to inspire and challenge believers today, urging them to live out the values of the kingdom of God in a world that often clings to worldly norms and values. Today.